Welcome to Lore of the Ring, where we uncover the hidden roads of Middle-earth and tell the tales that Tolkien never wrote. Before we begin, take a moment to let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time of day or night this narration has reached you. There are moments in history when the fate of entire worlds hangs upon decisions made in shadow-draped halls, whispered in languages older than stone. In the deep years of the Third Age, when darkness crept once more across Middle-earth like a stain spreading through water, the wisest and mightiest gathered in secret council. They were the White Council, bearers of ancient power, keepers of forgotten lore, guardians against the encroaching night. Elrond Half-Elven stood among them, his eyes reflecting centuries of sorrow and wisdom. Galadriel, Lady of Light, whose gaze could pierce the veils between worlds. Círdan the Shipwright, oldest of his kindred in Middle-earth, whose hands had shaped vessels for journeys beyond the circles of the world. And Saruman the White, chief among the Astari, whose mind was a labyrinth of knowledge and ambition. They met to discuss a shadow that had taken root in Dol Guldur, that accursed fortress in the south of Mirkwood where even the trees whispered of corruption. For years, they had debated, deliberated, watched, and waited. The Necromancer, they called him, a title that concealed a terrible truth. Some suspected, some knew. But all hesitated at the precipice of action, for to move against such power required certainty, unity, and courage that even immortals might struggle to summon. But what if, in that crucial hour, they had failed? What if the Council's wisdom had proven insufficient, their unity fractured, their strike delayed until too late? What if Sauron, the Dark Lord, ancient enemy of all free peoples, had slipped through their grasp like smoke through grasping fingers? The thought itself is a cold wind blowing across unmarked graves, a chill that settles in the marrow of the world. For if the White Council had faltered, if their light had guttered and dimmed at the moment it was most needed, then the history we know, the heroic journey of the Ring-Bearer, the triumph at Mount Doom, the age of peace that followed, all of it would have unraveled like a tapestry pulled apart thread by thread. Picture, if you will, the council chamber in Rivendell, autumn light falling through high windows, illuminating faces grave with concern. Or perhaps they met in Lothlorien, beneath the golden leaves of the Malorn trees, where even the air seemed to shimmer with ancient magic. Wherever they gathered, the weight of their deliberations pressed upon them like the burden of the sky itself. They spoke of omens and portents, of evil stirring in forgotten places, of creatures twisted by shadow emerging from caves and caverns. They debated strategies, marshaled their knowledge, considered and reconsidered their options. And all the while, in Dol Guldur, a presence watched. A will of iron and flame observed their hesitation, their uncertainty, their proud assumption that time remained their ally. Sauron had learned patience through millennia of defeat and resurgence. He had learned cunning from bitter experience. And he had learned, above all, how to turn the wisdom of the wise against itself, to use their very caution as a weapon, to make them doubt when they should act, to hesitate when they should strike. The hour they failed would mark the beginning of a world undone. A shadow would spread unchecked across Middle-earth, consuming hope like fire consuming parchment, leaving nothing but ash and memory. The great kingdoms would fall one by one, not in glorious battle but in slow suffocation, strangled by fear and darkness. And the One Ring, that most perilous of all created things, would remain hidden in shadow, waiting for a master who knew its every secret, who had poured his very essence into its making, who would stop at nothing to reclaim what was his. This is the story of that failure. This is the tale of what might have been when the guardians of light hesitated and darkness claimed the world. To understand how catastrophe might have unfolded, we must first understand what stood against it. The White Council was no hasty alliance, no desperate gathering of the moment. It was formed deliberately, with grave purpose, in the year 2463 of the Third Age. Nearly 5 centuries before the War of the Ring that would define an era, the wise perceived a shadow returning to Middle-earth. Strange reports filtered through the woodland realms, travelers disappearing on the old forest roads, darkness deepening in Mirkwood, creatures of malice emerging from long-forgotten lairs. Something ancient and terrible had taken up residence in Dol Guldur, that hill of sorcery in southern Mirkwood, and its presence corrupted everything it touched. Galadriel first proposed the council's formation, her foresight piercing further than most into the gathering gloom. She understood what many did not, that the scattered guardians of Middle-earth could not stand alone against what was coming. The Free Peoples needed coordination, shared wisdom, unified purpose. But even in its founding, the seeds of later failure were planted. For though many heeded Galadriel's call, not all came with pure intent. Saruman agreed to lead the council, but his motives were already compromised by desires he barely acknowledged to himself. The lore of the rings of power fascinated him, consumed him, whispered to him in dreams. He sought knowledge for knowledge's sake, but also for the power it promised, the control it offered. The council's membership represented the accumulated wisdom of ages. Elrond brought his deep understanding of history, having witnessed the rise and fall of kingdoms, the slow decay of the elder days into the diminished present. Galadriel contributed her insight, her perception that transcended normal sight, her ability to read the patterns of fate and choice that wove through the world like invisible threads. Círdan offered his ancient knowledge, memories that stretched back to the First Age, to times when the world was younger and filled with both greater glory and greater terror. The Astari, the wizards sent from the Undying Lands to counsel and aid the Free Peoples, added their power and purpose. Gandalf the Grey, though junior to Saruman in the Order's hierarchy, possessed a wisdom born of humility and genuine love for Middle-earth's peoples. Radagast the Brown, focused on beasts and birds, provided knowledge of the natural world's corruption. Together, they were formidable. Together, they were the best hope against the rising shadow. But even the brightest minds may falter, and a single error can echo across the ages. For all their power, they were not invincible. For all their wisdom, they were not infallible. They could be deceived, delayed, divided. And Sauron, ancient and cunning, beyond mortal comprehension, knew precisely how to exploit every weakness, every hesitation, every fracture in their unity. The council met irregularly over the centuries, debating what to do about the necromancer of Dol Guldur. Some suspected immediately that this was no mere wraith or lesser spirit of darkness, but Sauron himself returned to physical form after his defeat in the last alliance. Others remained uncertain, cautious about committing to action based on suspicion rather than proof. Year followed year, decade followed decade, and still they debated while the shadow grew stronger. Even when Gandalf himself infiltrated Dol Guldur and confirmed the terrible truth, that the necromancer was indeed Sauron, that the Dark Lord had returned, Saruman counseled patience, delay, further observation. Why did Saruman hesitate? The question haunts any examination of this period. Perhaps he already sought the One Ring for himself, hoping Sauron's presence would draw it forth so he might claim it. Perhaps he feared the cost of direct confrontation, the losses that would inevitably follow. Perhaps his pride made him believe he could control the situation, that his wisdom exceeded all others, that his judgment alone should determine the council's actions. Whatever the reason, his hesitation became the council's hesitation, and precious time slipped away like water through cupped hands. In our own history, the council eventually acted. In 2941, they finally moved against Dol Guldur, driving Sauron from his fortress. But it was a hollow victory, for the Dark Lord had already prepared his retreat to Mordor, where he would rebuild his power more openly, no longer hiding behind deception. The attack came too late to prevent his resurgence, only to inconvenience it. And the centuries of delay had allowed Sauron to lay plans within plans, to corrupt and suborn, to spread his influence like poison in the wells of Middle-earth. But what if even that hollow victory had not been achieved? What if the council's indecision had deepened into paralysis? What if internal conflicts had prevented even the delayed strike? The foundations were certainly there for such a failure. Pride, suspicion, divided purposes, the slow grinding of immortal time against the urgency of mortal need. To understand Sauron's advantage in this imagined failure, we must examine the nature of his power and cunning. He was no simple warlord, no mere conqueror relying on strength of arms alone. Sauron was among the Maiar angelic spirits who entered the world to serve the Valar, the great powers who shaped creation itself. Before his corruption by Morgoth, the first Dark Lord, Sauron had been a spirit of order and craft, a maker and organizer of surpassing skill. His fall into evil did not diminish his abilities. It twisted them, turned them toward domination rather than creation, toward control rather than cooperation. And through millennia of warfare, defeat, and resurgence, he had learned lessons that made him more dangerous than ever. Chief among these was the art of deception. Sauron understood that raw power could be overcome by alliance, by heroes rising in desperate hours, by the unpredictable courage of free peoples making free choices. But deception, carefully applied, could prevent such opposition from ever coalescing. It could turn potential allies against each other, could make the wise doubt their wisdom, could transform strength into weakness through the subtle poison of suspicion and fear. His establishment at Dol Guldur was itself a masterstroke of deception. The fortress stood in southern Mirkwood, not in Mordor where his old seat of power lay dormant and watched. By hiding behind the guise of the necromancer, he could slowly rebuild his strength while the guardians of Middle-earth debated what threat he might represent. The very uncertainty was his shield, for how could they act decisively against what they could not definitively identify? Saruman's Council of Patience played directly into this strategy, though whether Saruman realized how thoroughly he was being manipulated remains a subject of dark speculation among those who study such histories. From Dol Guldur, Sauron's influence spread through subtle channels. The great forest of Mirkwood itself darkened under his shadow, its very name changing from Greenwood the Great to reflect the corruption seeping through root and branch. Spiders descended from the ancient horror Ungoliant multiplied in the forest's depths, growing to monstrous size, their webs tangling the paths that travelers once walked in safety. Orcs and wolves ventured from their mountain lairs more boldly, raiding and killing with new ferocity. The woodmen and the sylvan elves of King Thranduil found themselves beset on all sides, slowly pushed back into ever-shrinking havens of light. But these visible signs of malice were merely the surface manifestations of deeper designs. Sauron's true focus lay elsewhere, on the One Ring, the source of his greatest power and his ultimate downfall. He knew it survived, though he knew not where. He knew that without it, his power remained incomplete, his dominion vulnerable. Every action, every strategy, every deployment of force served dual purposes: immediate tactical advantage and the long game of drawing the ring forth from its hiding place or preventing others from using it against him. If the White Council failed to act, if they allowed him to continue his work undisturbed, Sauron could gradually extend his network of spies and servants across all of Middle-earth. His servants would infiltrate courts and councils, whispering counsel that served his purposes while seeming to serve their listeners' interests. His agents would search tirelessly for any hint of the ring's location, following rumors and legends, investigating every possibility no matter how remote. His armies would grow in secret places, deep caverns, hidden valleys, fortresses far from watchful eyes, until he possessed strength sufficient to overwhelm all opposition in a single, devastating campaign. The geography of Dol Guldur itself aided this strategy. The fortress stood on a high hill amid tangled forests, approached by paths that twisted and turned, that seemed to shift their course when unwatched. Mist rose from the forest floor even in high summer, cloaking movements, concealing numbers. The walls were built of black stone that drank in light, that seemed to emanate cold even under the noon sun. Towers rose like accusing fingers, their windows dark or flickering with unwholesome fires. And beneath, delving deep into the living rock, dungeons and torture chambers where captives were broken in body and spirit, their wills bent to serve new masters. To assault such a place required not merely courage but overwhelming force, and even then success was far from certain. Sauron had learned the arts of fortresscraft from Morgoth himself, and he had millennia to perfect his defenses. The very stones would resist intruders, sapping their strength, turning them around until they wandered lost in corridors that should have been straight. Illusions would plague any who penetrated the outer walls, showing them horrors both real and imagined until they could no longer distinguish between the two. And if invaders somehow reached the inner sanctum, they would face Sauron himself, a being of terrible power even in his diminished state, wielding sorcery and malice refined through ages of practice. If the Council cannot perceive the shadow's subtle weave, how will they strike before it is too late? This was the trap Sauron laid, not a trap of walls and steel, but of doubt and delay. Let them debate endlessly while he prepared. Let them seek absolute certainty while he moved ahead with ruthless pragmatism. Let them worry about the cost of action while the cost of inaction mounted beyond calculation. Every day they hesitated was a day he grew stronger, his web spreading wider, his grasp reaching deeper into the affairs of Middle-earth. And beneath all his strategies lay a fundamental understanding of his enemy's psychology. The wise feared acting in haste because they remembered the terrible consequences of past rashness. The powerful hesitated to use their strength because they knew how easily power corrupted, how readily good intentions paved roads to ruin. The immortals thought in terms of centuries and millennia, while the crisis demanded response measured in years or even months. Sauron exploited all of this, using their virtues against them, turning their wisdom into paralysis. their caution into catastrophe. The fractures within the White Council ran deeper than disagreements over strategy or timing. They reflected fundamental differences in nature, purpose, and vision for Middle-earth's future. Understanding these divisions reveals why failure might have been inevitable despite the gathered wisdom and power. Saruman, the White, stood at the council's head, appointed by the Valor themselves to lead the Astari in their mission to aid Middle-earth against Sauron. His knowledge was vast, his mind keen as a razor, his understanding of ancient lore unmatched among those who walked the world in that age. But knowledge, pursued for its own sake, had become his master rather than his servant. The rings of power fascinated him to the point of obsession. He studied every fragment of information about their making, their powers, their locations. And slowly, imperceptibly even to himself at first, he began to desire them, not to destroy, but to understand, to possess, perhaps even to use. This corruption of purpose inevitably affected his counsel to the White Council. When others urged action against Dol Guldur, Saruman found reasons to delay. More information was needed. The timing was not yet right. Other threats demanded attention first. His arguments were always logical, always persuasive, cloaked in reason and apparent wisdom. But beneath them lay an agenda he would not acknowledge. Keep Sauron active but contained. Let the Dark Lord's presence draw out the One Ring, then seize it before Sauron could reclaim it. In this way, Saruman convinced himself he served the greater good while actually serving only his own pride and hunger for power. Galadriel perceived much of this, her sight penetrating veils that obscured truth from lesser eyes. She had looked into the hearts of great and small for thousands of years, and she recognized the subtle dimming of Saruman's light. But how to address it? Direct accusation would fracture the council entirely, driving Saruman into open opposition or causing him to withdraw his considerable knowledge and power from their cause. And she herself was not free from the temptation that corroded Saruman. Had she not been offered the One Ring in ages past? Had she not felt its pull, its promise of power to preserve what she loved, to rule with wisdom and beauty and strength? She had refused, had passed the test that Saruman was failing, but the memory of that temptation made her hesitate to judge too harshly, to act too quickly. Between them stood Elrond, playing mediator and counselor, trying to bridge the widening gap between Saruman's hidden ambitions and Galadriel's urgent warnings. Elrond's wisdom was born of sorrow, of watching kingdoms rise and fall, of witnessing the slow decline of everything he loved. He understood the weight of leadership, the burden of making decisions when no choice seemed truly right. And so he sought compromise, tried to find paths that might preserve unity while still addressing the threat. But compromise, however well-intentioned, can become complicity when facing absolute evil. There are moments when unity matters less than action, when debate must end and decision must be made regardless of disagreement. Gandalf alone seemed to grasp the urgency without reservation. Perhaps because he walked more closely with mortals, sharing their joys and sorrows, their brief, urgent lives gave him perspective that the immortal elves lacked. He saw how quickly darkness could overwhelm those without centuries to plan and prepare. He understood that for men, for hobbits, for the dwarves in their mountain halls, delay meant death, meant watching their children grow up in increasing shadow, meant extinction racing toward them while the wise debated in distant councils. His frustration with the council's inaction burned in him like a coal that would not be quenched. But Gandalf was not the chief of the Astari. Saruman held that position, and with it came authority that even the elven lords hesitated to override. In the hierarchies that governed the immortals, in the traditions and protocols that shaped their interactions across vast stretches of time, there were proprieties to be observed, forms to be followed. To reject Saruman's leadership would require overwhelming cause, undeniable proof of his unworthiness. And Saruman was far too clever to provide such proof. His arguments remained reasonable, his manner calm and authoritative, his knowledge demonstrably superior on matters of ring lore and ancient history. Círdan the Shipwright brought yet another perspective, one focused on the ultimate destiny of the elves in Middle-earth. He understood, perhaps more clearly than any other, that the time of the elves was ending regardless of Sauron's rise or fall. The great works of the Elder Days were fading, their glory passing into memory and legend. The future belonged to men, shorter-lived, more impulsive, less wise perhaps, but possessing a vitality and capacity for change that immortals lacked. For Círdan, the question was not whether darkness could be permanently defeated, but whether enough light could be preserved to carry into whatever age followed, whether the sacrifices of the past could find meaning in the future. This long view, this acceptance of inevitable decline, could seem like fatalism to those fighting desperately for every year, every day, every hour of peace and safety. But it was not surrender. Rather, it was a different kind of courage, the strength to continue striving even when ultimate victory appeared impossible, to preserve what could be preserved, to pass the torch to new hands even knowing they might let it fall. While they argued, the shadow grew, and the world waited unaware for the first strike of a darkness unchallenged. In council chambers where wisdom gathered, pride and caution wrestled with urgency and fear. Days became weeks, weeks became months, months stretched into years. Messengers came with increasingly dire reports. Entire villages abandoned in the shadow of Mirkwood, refugees fleeing to Esgaroth and Dale, trade routes severed, isolated communities cut off from all contact. And still the council debated, discussed, deliberated. In Dol Guldur, Sauron watched and smiled, if such a being could be said to smile. Every day of delay was victory. Every fractured argument, every postponed decision, every compromise that preserved unity at the cost of action, all of it served his purposes. He need not defeat the White Council in open battle. He need only keep them divided, uncertain, hesitant until the moment for effective opposition passed beyond recall. And he was succeeding beyond his most optimistic calculations. The fortress of Dol Guldur deserves deeper examination, for it was both symbol and instrument of the shadow that might have consumed Middle-earth. Its very name, Hill of Sorcery in the tongue of the Sindar, spoke of dark purposes and corrupted power. Before Sauron's occupation, it had been known by other names, innocent names that time has since forgotten. But his presence transformed it, twisted it, made the very stones cry out in anguish at the evil worked within their compass. Approach the fortress as a traveler might have in those dark years, wandering lost in southern Mirkwood, and you would first notice the trees. Ancient they were, gnarled and massive, their roots delving deep into soil that had grown poisoned, their branches reaching toward a sky they could barely glimpse through the perpetual canopy. But near Dol Guldur, the trees changed character. They grew twisted, their bark blackened as if by fire, their branches reaching not upward but inward, creating a maze of wood and shadow that seemed almost intentionally confusing. Travelers reported that paths which should have led away from the fortress instead curved back toward it, that the very forest conspired to deliver victims to the dark power dwelling at its heart. As one drew nearer, the undergrowth thinned, not because of any gardening, but because nothing would grow in that blighted ground. The earth itself became ashen, crumbling beneath footsteps like the dust of ancient graves. Strange fungi sprouted in the shadows, pale, bulbous things that glowed with sickly phosphorescence, releasing spores that caused nightmares and waking terrors. The air grew heavy, thick, difficult to draw into laboring lungs. Birds fell silent. Even insects ceased their buzzing, as if all life fled from proximity to such concentrated malice. Then the hill itself would loom into view, rising abruptly from the forest floor, its slopes too regular to be entirely natural, as if ancient hands had shaped it for purposes lost to memory. The fortress crowned this prominence, a sprawling structure of black stone, its walls thick and high, its towers reaching like clawed fingers toward the hidden sky. No banners flew from those towers. No guards walked visible on those walls. But eyes watched, always watched, tracking every movement within miles of the fortress, marking every traveler who passed too near, noting every detail for the intelligence of the power within. The gates stood perpetually open, a mockery of invitation. Those black iron doors, tall enough to admit giants, gaped like the mouth of some enormous beast, revealing only deeper darkness beyond. For the fortress was not merely a structure, but a trap, designed to lure, to capture, to break. The unwary, the desperate, the foolish, all might enter seeking shelter from the forest's terrors, only to discover that the true terror lay within. And once inside, escape became nearly impossible. The corridors twisted back on themselves, staircases led to nowhere, rooms changed their positions when unwatched, doors vanished and reappeared according to no logic mortals could discern. This was architecture as torture, space itself weaponized against intruders. Sauron had learned much from Morgoth about the breaking of wills and spirits, and he had adapted those lessons to suit his own particular genius for domination. Those captured in Mirkwood or seized by raiding parties were brought here, dragged through those gates into darkness that swallowed hope. Some were questioned, their knowledge extracted through pain and terror before they were discarded like broken tools. Others were kept alive far longer, twisted slowly over months or years, their very natures corrupted until they became servants of the shadow, sent forth to work its will in the wider world. Deep beneath the hill, Sauron had delved chambers that plunged down into the living rock, down to where heat pressed up from the earth's roots, where even the stone seemed to sweat in the darkness. Here he worked his sorceries, forging not weapons of steel, but weapons of fear and domination. Here he reached out with his will, sending it questing across Middle-earth like invisible tentacles, searching for the One Ring, seeking any trace of its location, any whisper of its presence. And here he planned, laying strategies within strategies, preparing for the day when he would emerge from this stronghold and reclaim dominion over all the lands from the sea to the mountains and beyond. To assault such a fortress required more than armies and siege engines. It required power to match the power within, wisdom to navigate the deceptions and illusions, courage that would not break even when confronted with calculated terror. And even if all these could be mustered, success was far from guaranteed. Sauron had been besieged before, in Mordor at the end of the Second Age, and that siege had lasted 7 years before the gates finally fell. Here in Dol Guldur, surrounded by forest that hindered approach, in a fortress designed with all his accumulated knowledge of defense and deception, he might withstand assault for decades. And with every year of siege, the rest of Middle-earth would grow weaker, its resources expended, its peoples exhausted, until the defenders of light had nothing left to give. The gates remained closed, the darkness unchallenged, and a storm gathered over Middle-earth that no light may pierce. This was the nightmare scenario, that the White Council, recognizing the magnitude of the threat, would hesitate at the threshold of action, would calculate the costs and find them too high, would preserve their strength for a more favorable moment that would never come. And while they waited, Sauron would prepare his masterstroke, would lay plans that would unfold across years and decades, would position his pieces on the great game board until checkmate became inevitable. For Dol Guldur was never meant to be permanent. It was a staging ground, a place of temporary concealment while greater works were prepared. In Mordor, the Dark Tower was rising again, rebuilt from ruins, its walls climbing higher year by year. In Minas Morgul, the Nazgul gathered, those 9 kings of men who had taken rings from Sauron in ages past and been consumed by them, becoming wraiths, neither living nor dead, utterly enslaved to the will of the Ring Lord. In the mountain fastnesses of the Misty Mountains and the Grey Mountains, in the southern deserts of Harad and the eastern kingdoms of Rhûn, servants and allies were gathering, armies forming, waiting only for the word to march. Dol Guldur's purpose was to distract, to focus attention away from these greater preparations, to make the defenders of Middle-earth believe they still had time when time had already run out. And if the White Council failed to act even against this decoy, this temporary fortress, then what hope was there that they could stand against Sauron's full might when he finally revealed it? Among the members of the White Council, the Maiar, Saruman, Gandalf, and Radagast occupied peculiar positions. They were spirits clothed in flesh, immortal beings who had volunteered to take mortal form and dwell in Middle-earth to aid in the struggle against Sauron. But their mission came with restrictions. They were forbidden to match Sauron's power directly, to dominate the wills of free peoples, or to rule openly. Instead, they were to counsel, to guide, to inspire others to action. This limitation, intended to prevent them from becoming tyrants themselves, also meant they could not simply smite their enemies with overwhelming force. They had to work through others, and therein lay both their strength and their vulnerability. Saruman's response to this restriction was to accumulate knowledge and influence, to become indispensable through wisdom rather than raw power. He established himself at Isengard, in the Tower of Orthanc, where he could study in peace and gather intelligence from across Middle-earth. His network of spies and informants rivaled even Sauron's, though the purposes to which he put this information grew increasingly questionable. He told himself he sought to understand the enemy to better defeat him, but understanding slowly transformed into fascination, and fascination into a perverse kind of admiration. Sauron, after all, had accomplished so much with the rings of power. Might not such power be turned to better ends by one truly wise? Might not Saruman himself succeed where Sauron had failed, bringing order to Middle-earth not through tyranny, but through benevolent dominion? These thoughts, seductive and insidious, infected his counsel to the White Council like poison in wine. When others urged immediate action against Dol Guldur, Saruman saw complications they ignored. What if attacking Sauron in his fortress only drove him into open war before Middle-earth was ready? What if the assault failed and the failure emboldened the enemy? What if, always another reason for delay, another argument for caution? And because Saruman clothed his counsel in reason and apparent wisdom, because he could cite precedents from history and quote from ancient texts, others found it difficult to simply dismiss his concerns and act despite them. Galadriel's frustration with this situation manifested as a kind of sorrowful patience, though beneath that patience burned a fire of urgency that grew more intense with each passing year. She had seen ages rise and fall. She had witnessed the glory of Valinor before the darkening, had fled the destruction of Beleriand, had watched kingdoms of elves and men flourish and fade like flowers blooming for a single season. This weight of memory, of accumulated loss, gave her perspective that could appear as detachment to those who did not know her. But she loved Middle-earth with an intensity that had not diminished across millennia, loved its beauty and its peoples, loved even the mortality and change that made it so different from the undying lands of her youth. When she looked at Saruman now, she saw the fading of his light, the dimming of his purpose. The ring had not merely tempted him, it was consuming him from within, hollowing him out, replacing wisdom with cleverness, courage with calculation, genuine concern with self-interest masked as broader considerations. She could have forced a confrontation, could have demanded the council choose between Saruman's leadership and hers. But such a schism might have destroyed the council entirely, leaving Middle-earth with no coordinated defense against the shadow. And so she endured and counseled, and waited for the moment when even Saruman would have to acknowledge the necessity of action. But what if that moment never came? What if Saruman's corruption advanced to the point where he actively sabotaged efforts against Sauron rather than merely delaying them? The possibility was not remote. In our history, Saruman eventually betrayed the White Council, seeking the One Ring for himself, even allying with Sauron while believing he could ultimately seize power from the Dark Lord. That betrayal came late, after the Council had finally acted against Dol Guldur, after events were already in motion. But if circumstances had unfolded differently, if the Council's paralysis had deepened, might not Saruman's treachery have manifested sooner and more catastrophically? Gandalf alone seemed immune to the creeping despair and doubt that afflicted the others. Perhaps it was because he spent less time in the lofty councils of the wise and more time walking among common folk, sharing meals in humble homes, listening to the stories and songs of people who would never wield power or shape history, but whose lives mattered nonetheless. He saw how shadow affected them, not as abstract strategic concern, but as immediate threat to everything they held dear. A farmer whose fields lay too near Mirkwood, watching the forest's darkness creep closer year by year. A mother in Esgaroth, afraid to let her children play outside because things with glowing eyes had been spotted at the forest's edge. A merchant whose livelihood depended on roads that were no longer safe, whose choices came down to risking death by traveling or slow starvation by staying home. These encounters fueled Gandalf's urgency, his increasing impatience with the Council's endless deliberations. Yes, acting against Sauron carried risks. Yes, the cost might be high. But inaction carried costs too, costs measured in lives destroyed, in hope extinguished, in darkness advancing while light retreated. Every day of delay was a day some family huddled in terror. Some village made its last stand against overwhelming evil. Some brave soul stood alone against the shadow because no help was coming. But Gandalf's passionate arguments, however compelling to those with ears to hear, could not override Saruman's authority within the council's structure. The Grey Pilgrim, as he was sometimes called, lacked the stature and position to force action over the White Wizard's objections. He could counsel, could argue, could try to persuade, but ultimately the decision rested with others, and those others, bound by their own natures and the weight of their long lives, moved with glacial slowness toward conclusions that Gandalf had reached centuries before. The hour grew late, and the hands that might have struck a decisive blow hesitated in the gathering dark. Imagine the council meeting for what would prove, in this darker timeline, to be the last time when coordinated action might have been possible. They gathered as they had gathered before in some secure location, perhaps Lothlorien, beneath the Malorn trees, or in Rivendell, in chambers filled with the light of stars and the memory of ancient days. The reports had grown dire beyond ignoring. Entire swaths of Mirkwood now lay under complete shadow. The woodmen were abandoning their settlements, fleeing north toward Thranduil's halls or west toward the lands of the Beornings. Travelers spoke of vast shapes moving through the forest at night, of drums beating in the deep places, of smoke rising from Dol Guldur that stained the sky for miles. Gandalf spoke with controlled passion, laying out the case for immediate action. Sauron's power was growing daily. If they struck now, they might still catch him before he reached his full strength. But if they continued to delay, the moment would pass when assault could succeed, and they would be forced into defensive warfare with initiative given entirely to the enemy. Galadriel supported his arguments, adding her own foresight and perception. She spoke of the patterns she could see forming, of threads of fate drawing together towards some critical moment. Action now might alter those patterns, might open possibilities currently closed. But if they waited, the paths would narrow until only the darkest remained available. Elrond urged compromise, some middle path between immediate assault and continued inaction. Perhaps a reconnaissance in force, testing Dol Guldur's defenses, gathering more information before committing to full-scale attack. It was a reasonable suggestion, the kind of measured response that had served him well through countless challenges over thousands of years. And Saruman countered it all with his own arguments, superficially reasonable, perfectly logical, and utterly wrong. He spoke of the risks, of the costs, of the many unknowns. He reminded them of past failures when hasty action had led to disaster. He suggested that Sauron, while certainly a threat, might be contained through less costly means: increased vigilance, stronger defenses, diplomatic efforts to unify the free peoples without the expense and risk of direct assault. Every point he made had merit in isolation, but taken together they created a pattern of delay, of postponement, of excuses to avoid action that might disrupt his own private schemes. And in the end, the council adjourned without decision. They would meet again. They would gather more information. They would prepare more thoroughly. The moment passed and would not come again. Within months, Sauron struck first. In the history we know, the One Ring remained hidden for thousands of years, lost in the depths of the Anduin River after Isildur's death, then found by the creature Gollum and carried into the roots of the Misty Mountains, kept secret in darkness and isolation. This long hiding was Middle-earth's salvation, for it kept the ring from Sauron's hand even as it kept Sauron from achieving his full power. He could recover much, could rebuild armies, reconquer lands, spread terror and shadow. But without the ring, his dominion remained incomplete, vulnerable to overthrow by alliance and heroic effort. But if the White Council failed to act, if Sauron gained time and freedom to work his will unopposed, the ring's hiding became less secure. For Sauron's search was not random, but systematic, guided by intelligence and ancient knowledge, refined by centuries of experience. He knew the ring survived. He knew it called to power-hungry minds, that it would not remain hidden forever, but would work its way back into the world through the corruption of whoever possessed it. And he had agents searching, not just the Nazgul, those terrible wraiths who served him utterly, but countless others who might not even know whose purposes they served. The chain of happenstance that led to the ring's eventual discovery in our history was fragile, dependent on specific events occurring in specific order. Bilbo Baggins, wandering lost in goblin tunnels, just happened to find the ring in the dark. Gollum, who had possessed it for centuries, just happened to lose it at precisely that moment. Gandalf, decades later, just happened to become suspicious about Bilbo's magic ring and investigate its nature. These coincidences, which seem in retrospect like destiny or providence guiding events, might not have occurred if the broader circumstances of Middle-earth had been significantly different. Consider, if the White Council never acted against Dol Guldur, if Sauron never felt pressured to abandon that stronghold and relocate openly to Mordor, then the events of The Hobbit might have unfolded very differently. Thorin Oakenshield and his company might have encountered far more dangerous opposition on their journey to Erebor. The necromancer, still in Dol Guldur, might have noticed and investigated a party of dwarves passing so near his stronghold. Gandalf might have been unable to join the quest, or might have been forced to abandon it earlier due to more pressing concerns. And without Gandalf's protection, without the specific combination of events that occurred, Bilbo might never have reached the Lonely Mountain, or might have reached it only to die in the attempt. Without Bilbo's journey, the ring remains with Gollum in the depths. Gollum, corrupt and secretive, would guard his precious with manic intensity, hiding from all contact, dwelling in darkness, slowly fading into a creature of pure malice and hunger. Years would pass, decades, perhaps centuries. And all the while, Sauron's agents would search, drawing their net ever tighter, investigating every rumor, every legend, every whisper of a magic ring with unusual properties. Eventually, inevitably, they would find leads pointing toward the misty mountains, toward the goblin kingdoms beneath the peaks, toward stories of a strange creature that lived in the deepest caverns and spoke to itself in the dark. Investigations would intensify. Expeditions would probe deeper. Goblins would be questioned, bribed, or tortured for information. And ultimately, Sauron's servants would corner Gollum in his lair, would take from him the ring he had guarded for so long, would bear it in triumph to their master. The moment Sauron reclaimed the One Ring, the balance of power in Middle-earth would shift catastrophically. Imagine that reunion, the Dark Lord, already mighty and terrible, taking back into his hand the object into which he had poured so much of his very essence, the instrument through which he could dominate all the other rings of power and bind their bearers to his will. The 9 Nazgul, already completely enslaved, would become even more terrible, their strength magnified, their resistance to opposition enhanced. The 7 rings given to dwarf lords, most of which Sauron had already recovered, would become tools of perfect control over those few dwarves still bearing them, breaking their legendary resistance to domination. And the 3 rings held by the elves, Vilya, worn by Elrond, Nenya, borne by Galadriel, Narya entrusted to Gandalf, would be revealed to Sauron's sight, their locations exposed, their bearers vulnerable to assault. Without the hand of the council to guide or delay him, Sauron's will spreads like wildfire across the land. With the One Ring restored, his power would not merely return, but would exceed what he had possessed even at the height of the Second Age. For he had learned from his defeat at the hands of the last alliance. He had studied his previous mistakes, had refined his strategies, had prepared against the kinds of resistance that had overthrown him before. And now, with the council paralyzed, with the free peoples disunited and unprepared, he would face no coordinated opposition, no grand alliance to stand against him. The first strikes would fall on those nearest to his seat of power. Gondor, that great kingdom of men which had stood for thousands of years as a bulwark against the shadow, would find itself beset on all sides. From Mordor to the east, armies would pour forth in numbers not seen since ancient days. Orcs and trolls, corrupted men from the southern and eastern lands, great siege engines built in the forges of the Dark Tower. From the south, the corsairs of Umbar would harass the coasts, cutting off maritime trade and reinforcement. From the southeast, the Haradrim would march with their Mumakil, those enormous war beasts that could break shield walls and trample cavalry beneath their feet. Gondor's strength, formidable though it was, had limits. The kingdom was already in slow decline, its population diminished from ancient heights, many of its greatest fortresses abandoned or garrisoned by mere remnants of their former strength. The line of kings had failed, leaving only stewards to govern in the absence of rightful rulers. Courage and tradition remained, but they could only accomplish so much against overwhelming force guided by implacable will. Without the quest of the ring-bearer to draw Sauron's attention elsewhere, without Aragorn to rally the forces of the West, without Gandalf to coordinate resistance, Gondor would stand alone, and standing alone would fall. Not in a day or a week, but slowly, agonizingly, as one fortress after another was besieged, starved, and finally overrun. Osgiliath, the ancient capital, would be taken and burned. Minas Tirith, the Tower of Guard, would endure siege until its walls cracked and its gates shattered. And when Gondor fell, the floodgates would open, and shadow would pour west and north into lands that had known centuries of relative peace. The domino effect of Gondor's fall would reshape all of Middle-earth. Rohan, the kingdom of horse lords who had long alliance with Gondor, would find itself suddenly isolated, its southern flank exposed, enemies approaching from multiple directions. The Rohirrim were mighty warriors, their cavalry legendary, but they were not numerous enough to hold against armies that could afford to trade 10 soldiers for everyone they lost. And Saruman, in his tower at Isengard, would see opportunity in Rohan's vulnerability. In our history, he openly betrayed his charge and attacked Rohan late, after his plans had already begun to unravel. But in this darker timeline, with the White Council effectively defunct and Sauron triumphant, Saruman might move earlier and more decisively, perhaps even coordinating with Sauron rather than futilely competing against him. Imagine Rohan caught between Isengard to the west and Mordor's allies to the south and east, a closing vice from which there could be no escape. The great cavalry charges that had saved the kingdom in previous conflicts would avail nothing against such overwhelming numbers, such coordination, such remorseless pressure from all sides. King Theoden, if he still lived, would face choices no king should have to make. Fight to the last and doom his people to extinction, or surrender and hope for mercy from enemies who knew nothing of that virtue. Either way, the mark would fall, and with it would die a culture, a way of life, a people who had ridden free across the plains for generations beyond counting. To the north, the realms of the elves would face their own catastrophes. Rivendell, Elrond's refuge in the valley hidden among the misty mountains, had stood for ages as a haven of wisdom and healing. But it was never a fortress in the military sense, never intended to withstand a determined assault by overwhelming force. Its security depended on concealment, on the difficulty of finding the valley, on the power of Vilya, Elrond's ring, to preserve and protect. But with the one ring in Sauron's hand, Vilya's power would be compromised, its protections vulnerable to penetration by Sauron's will. The hidden valley would be discovered, its approaches mapped, and armies would march through the passes to destroy it utterly. Lothlorien might endure longer, protected by Galadriel's power and the mystical quality of the forest itself, where time flowed strangely and intruders became lost in enchantments. But even Galadriel could not hold forever against the full might of Sauron wielding the One Ring. Her own ring, Nenya, which had preserved the beauty and power of her realm through long ages, would become a liability, a beacon drawing Sauron's attention, a point of vulnerability where his will could press and probe and eventually penetrate. She might retreat, taking her people across the sea to Valinor before the final fall. Or she might choose to stand and fight, to spend her power in one last desperate defense, buying time for others to escape, though knowing escape itself was futile. The woodland realm of Thranduil, already beset by shadow from Dol Guldur, would be simply overwhelmed. The Sylvan elves, valiant though they were, lacked the numbers and power to resist what would come. They would melt away into the forest like morning mist, becoming refugees in their own land, eventually driven north toward the utter desolation, or across the mountains toward settlements already overcrowded with their own displaced populations. And what of the Shire, that green and peaceful land where hobbits dwelt in comfortable ignorance of the great events shaping Middle-earth? In our history, the Shire was touched by war only lightly, preserved by Gandalf's watch and by fortune's favor, its people able to return from adventure to find their home relatively unspoiled. But in this darker timeline, no such mercy would be granted. The Shire lay directly in the path of forces moving to consolidate Sauron's control over the north. Its very fertility would mark it for conquest and exploitation. The hobbits, brave in their small way but utterly unprepared for war, would have no chance against orcs and wolves and corrupted men sweeping across their fields and hills. Some might escape, fleeing into the wilds or taking ship from the Grey Havens if any ships remained to sail. But the Shire itself would be destroyed, its gardens trampled, its holes broken open and looted, its people killed or enslaved, its peace shattered beyond any possibility of recovery. And with the Shire would die something irreplaceable: the simple goodness, the uncomplicated joy, the profound ordinariness that made hobbits the heart of goodness in Middle-earth. Their destruction would represent not merely a military conquest, but a spiritual catastrophe, the extinguishing of a light that had shone all the brighter for being so humble and unassuming. The fires spread faster than courage can respond, and every hope flickers against the advancing shadow. This would be the dominant reality of the age, Not epic battles where heroes made heroic stands, though some of those would occur, but a grinding, inexorable conquest that left no corner of Middle-earth untouched. Refugees would clog the roads, fleeing from burning homes with whatever they could carry. Isolated communities would make desperate stands, holding out for days or weeks before being overwhelmed. Survivors would tell stories of horror, of families torn apart, of children stolen in the night, of neighbors who had been twisted by torture or terror into serving the enemy against their own people. And through it all, the strategic truth would become inescapable. Without unity, without coordination, without the kind of leadership the White Council should have provided, the free peoples could not win. They were fighting dozens of isolated battles when they needed to fight one coordinated war. They were defending their own small territories when they needed to think in terms of Middle-earth as a whole. They were reacting to enemy moves when they needed to be forcing the enemy to react to theirs. Every advantage lay with Sauron, and every day that passed increased his dominion, while resistance withered like flowers before a killing frost. The political and social ramifications extended beyond military conquest into the very fabric of how peoples related to one another. Trust, always fragile between the races of Middle-earth, would erode under the pressure of fear and defeat. Men would blame elves for failing to use their power more decisively, for preparing to abandon Middle-earth rather than fighting for it. Elves would resent men's short-sighted policies and inability to maintain the vigilance that Sauron's threat required. Dwarves would withdraw into their mountain halls, sealing their gates against the world, trusting in stone and steel to protect them while caring little for the suffering of those outside. The ancient alliance between elves and men, forged in the wars of the First Age and renewed in the last alliance that ended the Second Age, would fracture beyond repair. Elves, perceiving that the time of their dominion in Middle-earth was ending regardless of Sauron's rise, would increasingly focus on their own survival and eventual departure. Why sacrifice lives and power in what appeared to be a losing cause? Why not preserve what could be preserved, ensuring that something of their glory would survive in the undying lands, even if Middle-earth itself fell into darkness? This calculation, however pragmatic it might seem from an immortal perspective, would appear as betrayal to men facing extinction. Where was the wisdom of the elves when it was most needed? Where was the power they had flaunted in ages past? The answer, that they were conserving it, husbanding it against final need, preparing for strategic retreat rather than meaningless sacrifice, would ring hollow to humans watching their children starve, their homes burn, their entire civilization collapsing. Among men themselves, fragmentation would accelerate. The great kingdoms like Gondor and Rohan would demand aid from lesser realms, from scattered tribes, from distant cousins across mountains and seas. But why should those remote peoples expend blood and treasure in someone else's war? Why rush to the aid of kings who had shown little interest in their welfare during times of peace? Ancient grudges would resurface. Old disputes over borders and resources would flare into open conflict. Instead of uniting against the common enemy, men would fracture into squabbling factions, each prioritizing its own immediate survival over the long-term survival of their race. Sauron would exploit these divisions with cruel efficiency. His agents would whisper in courts and councils, suggesting that accommodation might be possible, that terms could be negotiated, that submission need not mean slavery. Some would believe these lies, desperate to find any alternative to the destruction bearing down upon them. They would send emissaries to Mordor, would offer tribute and allegiance, would betray allies in exchange for promises of mercy that Sauron had no intention of keeping. And when these collaborators had served their purpose, when they had undermined resistance and delivered enemies into Sauron's hands, they too would be discarded, their rewards revealed as ash and mockery. The dwarves presented unique challenges and opportunities in this dark scenario. Their kingdoms in the mountains, Erebor under the mountain, the Iron Hills, the strongholds of the Blue Mountains, were formidable fortresses that could not be easily taken by force. Dwarves were warriors of legendary prowess, stubborn beyond belief, capable of defending their halls against seemingly impossible odds. But they were also insular by nature, more concerned with their own affairs than with the broader struggles of Middle-earth. They might seal their doors and wait out the storm, believing their stone walls would protect them until Sauron's attention turned elsewhere. This calculation would prove tragically mistaken. Sauron had long experience dealing with dwarves, dating back to the Second Age when he had given the 7 rings to dwarf lords, hoping to enslave them as he had enslaved the 9 kings of men. The dwarves had resisted that corruption, their hardy nature proving immune to domination. But the rings had infected them nonetheless with excessive greed and isolation, sowing discord and dragon sickness among their people. With the 1 ring in his hand, Sauron could exert even greater pressure on the remaining dwarf rings and their bearers, could corrupt the very stone of their mountains, could turn their legendary stubbornness from strength into fatal weakness. More practically, isolated fortresses, however strong, could be besieged and starved. Dwarves needed trade with the surface world for food, for certain resources, for the markets that made their craftsmanship profitable. Cut off from all external contact, subjected to endless assault, worn down by attrition and the psychological weight of fighting a war with no hope of victory, even the dwarves would eventually break. Their kingdoms would become tombs, their great works left unfinished, their people extinct or reduced to scattered survivors eking out existence in the deep places of the earth. A world once held together by fragile hope now teeters on the edge of an endless night. This phrase captures the essential truth of what the White Council's failure would have meant: the dissolution of everything that made Middle-earth worth preserving. Not merely the military defeat, though that would certainly occur, but the moral and spiritual collapse that would accompany it. When hope dies, when people cease to believe that tomorrow could be better than today, when despair becomes the default assumption shaping all decisions, that is when darkness truly triumphs, regardless of which armies hold which territories. The cultural losses would be incalculable. The songs and stories, the traditions and wisdom accumulated over thousands of years would be lost as peoples were scattered or destroyed. Languages would die with their last speakers. Arts and crafts perfected over generations would be forgotten. The very memory of how things once were, of beauty and peace, of joy and wonder, would fade until new generations grew up knowing only shadow, believing that the horror of their present was simply how the world had always been and must always be. And Sauron would not merely rule, but would remake Middle-earth according to his vision of perfect order. Forests would be cleared to deny refuge to rebels. Mountains would be mined until their bones were stripped bare. Rivers would be diverted to serve industrial purposes regardless of ecological consequences. The very landscape would be transformed into a reflection of its master's nature. Harsh, utilitarian, devoid of beauty or mercy, every element serving a purpose in the great machine of domination. The free peoples who survived would become slaves, their children raised in captivity, bred for specific purposes, their spirits broken through systematic cruelty. Within a few generations, they would forget they had ever been free, would accept their subjugation as natural and inevitable. And that would be Sauron's ultimate victory, not merely to conquer, but to convince the conquered that no other way of life was possible, that resistance was futile, that hope itself was a delusion only fools entertained. Yet even in this darkest of hypothetical timelines, complete despair would not be quite warranted. For Tolkien's vision of Middle-earth was rooted in eucatastrophe, the sudden turn when all seems lost, the unexpected deliverance, the principle that good contains within itself the seed of victory precisely because it is good. The White Council's failure would make resistance infinitely more costly, would doom millions to suffering and death, would plunge Middle-earth into darkness for generations. But it would not make ultimate victory impossible, only unimaginably difficult. Light has a quality that darkness lacks. It can exist in the smallest quantities and still be light. A single candle drives back the night in its immediate vicinity. A small act of courage can inspire others to courage. A community that maintains its values and traditions despite occupation keeps alive the possibility that those values might someday be restored to wider practice. Despair is the enemy's greatest weapon, and the refusal of despair, even when all rational calculation suggests it is warranted, can become a form of resistance more powerful than armies. Perhaps in this darker world, new heroes would emerge from unexpected places. The prophecies and patterns that guided our history might be fulfilled through different people, different choices, different paths to the same ultimate destination. If Bilbo never found the ring in goblin tunnels, perhaps another would find it elsewhere. If Frodo never bore it to Mount Doom in our history's sequence of events, perhaps another hobbit, another humble soul would undertake that burden in a different time, under different circumstances. The mechanisms of fate or providence that Tolkien embedded in his mythology would not be entirely thwarted even by the catastrophic failure of the wise. Gandalf, particularly, would not accept defeat even when defeat appeared total. In our history, he fell in Moria fighting the Balrog and was sent back with greater power to complete his mission. In this darker timeline, might he not fall earlier, fighting desperately against overwhelming odds, yet be returned again because the valor, the great powers who shaped the world, recognized that Middle-earth still needed him? His mission was not merely to advise the White Council, but to oppose Sauron, and that mission would continue regardless of the Council's failure. And the elves, despite their weariness and readiness to depart Middle-earth, would not abandon it entirely without a final stand. Elrond, Galadriel, Círdan, these were not beings who surrendered lightly, who would slink away into the west without offering whatever resistance they could still muster. Their power might be insufficient to overthrow Sauron, but it could preserve refuges, could maintain hidden havens where hope survived, could pass knowledge and weapons to those who would continue the fight after the elves themselves had departed. The Eagles might intervene more directly than in our history, where they served primarily as rescuers of last resort. The Ents might march against Isengard, not in response to Saruman's tree cutting, but as a desperate defense of the forest itself against encroaching shadow. Tom Bombadil, that strange and powerful being whose nature Tolkien never fully explained, might step forth from his self-imposed exile to play a role he declined in our timeline. Beorn and his descendants might become not merely a curiosity of the North, but a rallying point for resistance, their strength and fury legendary among those fighting for freedom. Perhaps the Valar themselves would intervene, as they had in the First Age when Morgoth's power threatened to consume all of Middle-earth. That intervention had required sundering the very shape of the world, transforming it from flat to round, removing the undying lands from physical reach. Would they act again if Sauron's triumph appeared complete? Or had they committed to non-intervention, leaving Middle-earth to the choices and consequences of those who dwelt there? These questions touch on the deepest theological and philosophical elements of Tolkien's mythology, where divine providence exists but does not eliminate genuine choice and consequence. The prophecy of the Dunedain, that the line of Elendil would endure while the shadow lasted, might fulfill itself through unexpected channels. If Aragorn fell before reclaiming his throne, might another heir exist, hidden even from the knowledge of those who kept genealogies and records? Might the blood of Númenor, scattered through the kingdoms of men, produce a leader who could rally resistance when all other leadership had failed? The right person in the right moment, making the right choice, can shift the course of history regardless of how dire the situation appears. Most importantly, the fundamental nature of evil would remain unchanged. Sauron, for all his power and cunning, was diminished from what he had been, incapable of true creation, able only to corrupt and dominate. His realm, however extensive, would be built on fear and compulsion, not genuine loyalty. Such dominions always contain the seeds of their own destruction, for slaves and servants ruled by terror will turn on their master when opportunity arises. The more complete Sauron's control, the more dependent he would become on the One Ring to maintain it. And the ring, for all its power, had a fatal flaw. It could be destroyed, and in its destruction, all Sauron's works would collapse. This weakness, this essential vulnerability at the heart of his power, meant that even in total victory, he would remain vulnerable to overthrow. One need only reach Mount Doom, penetrate the Samath nor where the ring was forged, and cast it into the fires. Impossible. Nearly so, but not quite. And nearly impossible creates a very different strategic situation than absolutely impossible. Where hope remains even in theory, courage can sustain itself. Where destruction of the enemy remains achievable, even at suicidal cost, resistance can continue. Perhaps the White Council did not fail, but the shadow forever remembers the paths not taken, and the world remains forever on the knife's edge between despair and salvation. This ending note acknowledges both the hypothetical nature of our exploration and its relevance to Tolkien's actual narrative. The Council did act, albeit delayed and imperfectly. They drove Sauron from Dol Guldur, forcing him into the open where his actions could no longer be concealed or denied. This bought precious time for the finding of the ring, for the growth and preparation of those who would ultimately oppose him, for the pieces to move into position for the final confrontation. But it was a near thing, closer than many realized. Had decisions gone slightly differently, had key moments of choice resolved toward caution rather than courage, the entire timeline could have shifted toward the darkness we have explored. The fact that it did not, that heroes emerged and prevailed, that the ring was destroyed and Sauron overthrown, should not make us complacent about how close things came to disaster. The margin between triumph and catastrophe was razor-thin, measured in individual choices, in moments of courage or wisdom, in accidents and coincidences that, examined closely, seem almost like Providence guiding events toward their destined conclusion. Tolkien believed in this interplay between fate and free will, between the large patterns of history and the small choices of individuals. He believed that good would ultimately triumph not because it was stronger, but because it was good, because it aligned with the fundamental nature of reality created by Eru Ilúvatar, the one god above the valor, whose music brought the world into being. But he also believed in genuine struggle, real cost, the possibility of failure, and the courage required to act despite that possibility. His mythology honors both divine providence and individual agency, both the large arc bending toward justice and the immediate moment demanding heroic choice. The White Council's story exemplifies this tension. They were powerful, wise, well-intentioned, but also proud, cautious, vulnerable to deception and internal division. Their near-failure highlights how even the best-equipped guardians can stumble when facing evil that is patient, cunning, and willing to exploit every weakness. And their ultimate action, delayed though it was, demonstrates that failure is never inevitable while will and courage remain. So we remember the paths not taken, the timelines that might have been, the shadows that were turned aside by choices that could have gone differently. We remember them not to despair at how close darkness came, but to honor those whose wisdom and courage, however imperfect, proved sufficient to the challenge. And we remember that the struggle continues, that in every age new shadows arise requiring new counsels, new wisdom, new courage to face them. The lesson of the White Council's near failure is not that all is hopeless when the wise stumble, but that wisdom itself requires constant vigilance, honest self-examination, and the humility to recognize when caution has become paralysis, when pride has compromised judgment, when unity requires acknowledging uncomfortable truths. These are challenges not only for fantasy councils in imagined worlds, but for all who bear responsibility for protecting what they love against forces that would destroy it. And so the story ends where all Tolkien's stories end, not in simple triumph or absolute defeat, but in bittersweet victory purchased at great cost, in continued vigilance against shadows that never entirely fade, in hope that persists despite all reason, and in the understanding that the choices we make, each of us in our own time and place, matter more than we may ever know. The White Council faced their moment. We will face ours. May we prove worthy of the choice when it comes. Dear listener, this story ends, but many await. Subscribe so no tale escapes you.